Our study today, Your Mind, Your Life, has to do with the creative forces of our thoughts. Interesting, Biga in the beginning of her prayer said, let us put our thoughts together. And sometimes we say things like this, and if we had eyes to see what happens in the spiritual plane, the invisible one, right here among us, we would be delighted to see the current of energies that will be embracing and evolving all of us at the moment of prayer. Here is the study of the books that we studied in order to bring some of our findings. And given that we have 30 minutes, I'm not going to say that I'm going to bring all of the information pertaining to the power of thought, the creative or damaging aspect of the thoughts in our daily lives. So I brought a few books with hopes that you guys will be interested in to go home and continue to study in the findings that we have brought here today. So we will begin with a little story. Once upon a time, an apprentice went to his master and said, Master, it has been said that iron cuts mountains. So iron is more powerful. Fire is capable of melting iron, which means indeed that fire has more power than iron. But then we also learn that fire can be controlled by water. So it makes water to be more powerful than fire. Eventually, water can be dried up by air. Thus, air is stronger than water. What then, Master, could be more powerful than air? He looks at the apprentice and says, Son, thoughts are more powerful than air. Therefore, you be powerful by retaining positive thoughts. It's pretty amazing, the little story that we found in the internet to give us an idea of the power of thought. He says, you be powerful. Be more powerful than your thoughts by retaining the positive ones. And so we begin with our study today. I have to give credit for the title, Your Mind, Your Life, because the latest edition of the Spiritism magazine, which is available for free online by PDF, actually brought a lot of topics and teachings pertaining to the life of Chico Xavier, the great medium that we all know of. But specifically, one article had to do with this topic, Your Mind, Your Life, and it was written by Kirsten de Mello. It's a really amazing magazine that they came up with this latest issue. So we started thinking about how interesting it is, the topic of the mind and the topic of thought. And we start seeing, as we read more and more, if we really understand the power that we actually can have over our own lives. We have a psychologist here among us, and she could basically tell us how much her own patients have been able to turn their lives around, right, Sherry, through the kind of assistance that they receive. So thankfully, not only do we have books that assist us in understanding that we do have the power over our lives, but we also have other means and other tools that we can utilize, such as the use of a professional, to understand many times how we are able to turn our lives around. We also see that many people are not aware of the power of their own thoughts, that to think really is to create. And then we see in the works of Allan Kardec and Andreia Lewis that indeed, in a whole other side of the spectrum that we cannot see, in the invisible realm, we understand how these creative forces work. How we are able to create images through the power of our thoughts. And naturally, we learn about the emotions that follow the thoughts. So we decided to bring some examples brought in here by Andreia Lewis, which we will see. One specifically, if you don't have the book, I really suggest that you do get it. It's called Action and Reaction, because they do tell us about the power that we have over creating our heaven or our hell upon discarnating. But Allan Kardec, in the book Genesis, brings us an interesting idea. Because here we are, maybe there are about 20 or 30 of us here, and we all have our different thoughts. Maybe some of us are thinking about what is she talking about. Some of us are wondering what's going to be brought into the study today. Other people may be thinking about the problems that we have outside that is waiting for us to fix. And some of us are just plainly thinking about what we're going to do after we leave the Spiritist Center. Regardless, we're here. We are at a gathering. Fluidic currents that are emanating from the beings whether it's discarnate or incarnate, is actually allowing for the impression to be a pleasant one. The same can be said if the impressions or the notes or the thoughts are discordant. It's going to be an unpleasant feeling. So Spiritism is not the only body of knowledge that will bring us the idea that to think is really to create. We all agree with that. It's not a new invention by Spiritism, but Andreia Lewis gives us another view of truly what happens with the creative power of the thought. We will see here today that there is going to be an abundant amount of information, and we don't mean to overwhelm anybody. It's just to kind of give us a little clue as to what is really awaiting us in the afterlife after we discarnate from the physical one, because we all already know this is a temporary. But it's also to make us realize a little bit about what we are creating for ourselves as we are here incarnated. Not only emotionally, physically, but also spiritually speaking. But back to this slide, what did Allan Kardec mean by fluidic currents? It's something that made us really see that the result is a multitude of fluidic currents. It's been said that we are immersed in an ocean of vibrations and waves and rays. There's even a topic about the breath of the Creator from which we are immersed in. The philosophical side of Spiritism is simply amazing and beautiful. But on chapter 14 of Genesis, we have an entire chapter. And if you don't have the Genesis, don't be afraid. It's the 5th book and the compilation brought on by Allan Kardec. It's the most scientific one. But it also gives us the beauty around everything that surrounds us in the universe. And chapter 14 is entitled completely to the study of fluids. It talks about the nature, the property. It talks about the quality, the formation, our own fluidic body, the perispirit, which deserves an entire book on it, and so much more. What Allan Kardec makes it very clear is that we are not going to propose that we are going to explain everything, because he even states that we don't yet have the capacity to understand everything there is to learn about fluids. Specifically, the universal cosmic fluid that we see here. The universal cosmic fluid whose modification and transformations comprise the innumerable variety of bodies found in nature. Andreia Lewis, in the book Workers of the Life Eternal, is invited to participate in a moment that if we read it and we envision, it blows our mind. What happens is that we're going to be receiving the visit from a very enlightened spirit. He is so enlightened that if he was to reincarnate on earth, they say that he would have to do it in intervals of 500 to 800 years. This is how enlightened he was. And he wasn't even purified up to the aspect of Christ as we have in purity, but this is how elevated he was. And Andreia Lewis is there with other people, and he is told to mentalize, to envision a landscape. One person would be responsible for the waters. The other would be responsible for the skies. Andreia Lewis would be responsible for the greens, the flooring, the grass, the trees. And so they do. They start envisioning this scenario. Collectively, individually, there is a chamber. And so when they look up, there is a fluidic formation. And the assistant, the person who's there with them, the instructor says, I'm not pleased yet. There can be a lot more done to this image. So Andreia Lewis starts picturing and envisioning little flowers that he used to pick with his wife. And when the work is done, there are 2 additional instructors who put their hands on the chamber, and the entire landscape becomes alive. It's an amazing chapter because it gives us the idea of the creative force of thinking and fluidically creating all of this. And Andreia Lewis says, I'm not going to try to explain how this happens because I would lack words in translating what I saw. So this is why Allan Kardec says that there is a lot for us that we can't yet understand the aspect of this universal cosmic fluid. But he gives us some idea that it says that at the starting point of the universal fluid is the degree of absolute purity, about which nothing can give us an idea. The opposite point is the transformation into tangible matter, everything that we see. And this is why when we read No Solar, and Andreia Lewis starts describing what he sees before him, buildings, schools, flowers, trees, we can kind of start having an idea where this is coming from. The transformation into tangible matter. The modification of the cosmic fluid while still in a state of etherealization form an infinite variety of distinct fluids with varying levels of purity. He goes on to say that they are referred as spiritual fluids, and it forms the material of the spiritual world. The spiritual fluids, which comprise one of the state of the universal cosmic fluids, are, properly stated, the atmosphere for the spirit beings. So this is where we wanted to get into, what Allan Kardec said about the fluidic currents that happens at a focal point of gathering where people are thinking at the same time. It's the environment also where the special spiritual phenomena happens, whether it's the materialization of an object or actually the way that a spirit is able to materialize itself with its perispiritual body. And not just that, a lot of what happens here, they're talking about the phenomenon that is perceptible to the spirit's sight and sense, but that actually is beyond our corporeal senses. So the spiritual fluids are like matter for the spiritual realm. And this is how we start understanding about the spiritual fluids that are utilized to create things. Spiritual matter is what they talk about. Matter for the spiritual life. So the spirits act upon these fluids. They're manipulating them by combining them. How is it done? We are not going to get into that yet, because the more we evolve, the more we will learn how we are able to become co-creators. Manipulating these fluids, combining them, organizing them to create a desired appearance or form, just as it's done with solids, with liquids and gases in the material world. This is what we are doing. So it's done with the appearance of the own perispirit, the appearance of objects, as we have noticed here, and even the buildings in the spirit realm. But they also say that for all of this to happen, the one thing that the spirit, actually the two things that the spirits use is thought and will. Thought and will. So in the spirit world, with the spiritual fluids, in the creation of all of this that we're talking about, thought and will is for the discarnate spirits what our hands and arms are for us here. Starts making sense, right? This is why I invite you guys to study the Genesis, because it's beautiful. It gives us also the idea and understanding that the spiritual fluid is the vehicle of thoughts. Fluidic currents. So the spiritual fluid is the vehicle of thoughts. Since the vehicle of thoughts, since the fluids are the vehicle of thoughts, thoughts act upon the fluid as sounds act upon the air. So fluid brings thought to us just as the air brings sounds. One could definitely say, therefore, that in these fluids there are waves and rays, which Emmanuel talks about also in the book, in the realms of mediumship, in giving us an idea of this interchange between the spiritual world and the physical world as well, that crisscross one another without mixing, just as in the air there are sounds, waves, and rays. Okay, so here we talk about this, and Allan Kardec mentions that because of all of this, we can consider that in the spiritual world, there is an immense laboratory and workshop of the spirit life. Because of all of this, in learning how to manipulate, in learning how to modify. And now it's where we're going to get, because in the book No Solar, the minister Veneranda, who has been there for 1,000-hour bonuses, right? That's how much she's made? Or years? 200 years. She's a highly enlightened spirit who's there, and she's made a commitment to be there out of love, basically, because she could actually go to higher spheres. But she actually starts at a gathering where Andreia Lewis is learning. Let's remember that No Solar is the very first book of the series Life in the Spirit World. So she starts out by saying that at that very moment where they were, there are a few hundred listeners among us who are surprised by the fact that our sphere, meaning the life in the spirit world, is full of forms similar to those on the planet. Haven't they learned that thought is universal language? Haven't they been told that mental creation means nearly everything in our lives? This is pretty powerful, the statement that Veneranda gives us. Many brothers and sisters are asking questions as to why there are earth-like dwellings, utensils, and languages here. This reality shouldn't surprise anyone, however. we mustn't forget that up to this point, as far as earthly existence is concerned, we have been living in old spheres of antagonistic vibrations. Thought is the basis for all human spiritual relationships. Is this amazing scene where she's there, and after she goes through all of this, explaining how as we evolve, as we progress, as we reincarnate, we start really, as we purify, learning how to develop this faculty that is one of the attributes of the Spirit's intelligence, thought, the ability to create. So she's talking about mental creation. Mental creation means nearly everything in our lives. What are we creating in our lives with our thoughts? And that's the question that we come up to. What do we create? And this is something very powerful. Let's see, in talking about mental creations, what Andreia Lewis has to say about this in a book entitled Evolution in Two Worlds. How these mental creations are actually able to occur. Andreia Lewis refers to thoughts as mental fluids, first and foremost. This is how he refers to thoughts in this book, Evolution in Two Worlds. The book is coming out soon, hopefully. It's not yet available. So what I brought here is directly from the book, as translated. He refers that the fluid, or mental matter, here's another way that he talks about thoughts, has its own ponderability and specific chemoelectromagnetic properties that are defined in perfectly measurable units similar to the periodic table of the chemical elements. Here's the first thing that he brings us as far as the thought is concerned. But then he goes on to say that the particle of thought as a fluidic corpuscle or body is like the atom, a unity in essence, although subdivided in diverse types according to the quantity, the quality, the behavior, the trajectories of its components. And then he says, just as the atom is living in powerful force in its composition, and this has been studied by science, and let's remember that this book was written in 1956, but passive before the intelligence that mobilizes it for good or ill, the particle of thought, although alive and powerful as it flows from the spirit that produces it, whether incarnate or discarnate, is also passive before the sentiment that gives it form and nature for good or for ill. From this we can say, wow, I don't know about you guys, but I'm a little bit blown away by the comment, this teaching that they bring, because they start giving us an idea that thought is matter, ponderability. Thought is matter, and how the spirits indeed are able to see our innermost thoughts. I may be here, shaking Biga's hand, giving her a kiss on the cheek, and mentally and inside in my emotions I'm saying, God, she's such a fake. I hate her. She can't see that because all she sees is my smile on the face. But the invisible realm around me can see because I am creating something. It's matter. And therefore it's visible to the invisible world as well. As we can see here, thoughts create fluidic images, as is reflected in the perispiritual envelope, as in a mirror. There it takes on a body and photographs itself somehow. So we decided to bring this image here to kind of give us an idea. This guy here, he's a little bit in doubt. Maybe he's in a moment of passion, hate and passion there. And one moment he is in love and he's thinking about this loving, tender moment with the woman there. And then the next one, he hates her and he actually wants to strangle her. So he's fluidically creating this in his perispiritual envelope. It acts as a mirror. So Genesis explains this very well to us. It says that as impassive as his physical body may be, because he's just thinking, he's not acting yet, his fluidic body goes into action by the means of thoughts and produces or reproduces all of the nuances. So here he's fluidically creating this. Fluidically he executes the motion, the act that he has the desire to accomplish. Let us think about this. How often do we do that in our daily lives? We're not talking about this. Maybe we're thinking about something else. We have to start paying attention to our thoughts and what we are creating. If we go to a doctor and they tell us that they found a little something that needs to be further examined, automatically we start thinking it's cancer. oh my God, I'm going to die. And we start creating all of these images that is not going to assist us in any way, shape, or form. And then we learn sometimes that thoughts acts like a boomerang. We throw it, it comes back. And we are going to see how that happens as well. So we have to be careful. The thought creates the images of the victim here, and the entire scenario plays out like a picture as it exists in his mind. Now let's say that this woman here has a few friends in the spirit realm who really do not like her from previous existences, obsessors. They see that this guy here can be an opportunity. Because if he's thinking this, he is connecting with forces that think alike. They see what his intentions are. And oftentimes they'll influence that, potentializing the force and the thought that is being played out. Andreia Lewis will say that a lot of the crimes that happen in our world has to do with the influence that we receive from the invisible realm. What are we associating ourselves? Who are we associating ourselves with through our thoughts? We have to think about this very clearly. And so this is how the most secret movements of our soul resound in the fluidic body. One soul can read the other. It starts making sense, right? If we start talking about the fluidic currents in the creation. This is why Veneranda, in the same chapter of the book Nosso Lar, says that thought is a living force everywhere. It is a creative atmosphere enveloping the Father and His children, the cause and effect of the universal home. Through thought, human beings become angels on their way to heaven or diabolical masterminds on their way to hell. This is how she puts it. So I found this thing here on the site called Positive Thinking on Facebook last night. It said, the mind in its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. This portrayed very clearly, because sometimes we are in such great state of mind and all of a sudden we create something out of nothing. The hell that we live in. As we keep going, we see more and more with the Spiritist teaching that we need to be mindful of our thoughts. That the scientific aspect of Spiritism indeed does bring a view of how thoughts are created. This amazing world that talks about cells and fluidic currents and everything else. But we can also learn how we attract the presence of the good spirits or the ill-intentioned spirits as well. The moral side of Spiritism gives us a liberating key. And I'm not sure, I'm talking about Spiritism here, the moral side of it, because we are in the Spiritist Center. We might even search other religions that will give us this support to be able to enlighten ourselves furthermore. Allan Kardec will also ask questions where the spirits will tell us that because of this, there is a combination of our own thoughts and that of the spirits. Sometimes even incarnate spirits. Because if it's waves and rays and currents, fluidic currents, we are going to understand that more and more. But he says that we are able to distinguish whether they're good or bad by studying the thoughts. That the good spirits will only give us good suggestions, good thoughts. So if I'm beyond my friend here, and automatically there comes an intent to say hello, be kind, it's a good suggestion. On the other hand, it says trip her, not a good suggestion. It's not a good thing to do. So be aware of that. And it makes us think, who are we in tune with? It's the saying, tell me who you're with and I'll tell you who you are. Also has to do with the spiritual plane. Who are we associating ourselves with and why? Why are we attracting the people incarnate or discarnate in our lives? We start talking about the aspect of obsession. Because sometimes if the fixated thought creates an obsessive movement, we're talking about obsession between discarnate and incarnate, incarnate and discarnate, incarnate and incarnate. Andreia Lewis brings us in a book also how the mental waves and thoughts of one affects the other who is incarnated. She feels the presence. And I don't remember the title of the book now. But it's beautiful portraying. I promise you guys I'll give you that information. But the problem with the creative force of our thoughts can't only be observed by us here in the physical realm, as who are we associating ourselves with. And I'm going to try to finalize really quickly here, because in the book Action and Reaction, Assistant Silas gives us an idea of what happens. He says here that we should picture our thoughts as a living and active force, whose speed is faster than light. Emitted by us unavoidably returns to us, compelling us to live of our own accord in the wave of created forms. The vital need for us always to keep ourselves in the noblest ideas and purest purposes of life is due to the fact that the energies attract other energies of the same kind. This we've already said here. So he says, when we dwell on vices or darkness, the mental force we exteriorize, we emanate, we throw out, return to our mind, forces which are reanimated and intensified by the elements we become in tune with. Reanimated and intensified. Consequently, we reinforce the bars of the prison in which we thoughtlessly remain. He says here that when the somatic body, when our physical body disappears in the ordinary phenomena of death, when we die, our spirit discarnated, moving in a vehicle more plastic, which is a fluidic body, more subject to the influences, can spend a long time as a prisoner in its unconstructive creations. This is how we see the way we live is going to play itself out in the spiritual realm as well, and remain in vast regions of suffering and illusion, together with those who share the same deceits and nightmares. And here's how we create our hell. There's no hell in the spiritual realm. We don't die and go to hell and some go to heaven. We create our own heaven or our own hell. And he goes on to say the guilt conscious also create their own heaven or hell from the mental emanations. And there are countless cases in the book Action and Reaction that we encourage everybody to read. Joana de Angelis, the spirit guide of Divaldo Franco, says that our minds are like powerful dynamos. Dynamos are generators. But she wasn't the only one who said that. Assistant Silas said the same thing. He said that we must remember that our thoughts act like waves that travel faster than light, and that every mind is a dynamo generating creative force. Now, if the good is the expansion of the light and the evil is the condensation of the darkness, then we lose ourselves in cruelty towards others. Our thoughts, which are waves of subtle energy permeating places and people, situations and matters that affect our memory, act and react upon each other in closed circuit, always bringing us back the unpleasant feelings caused by our contact with the unfortunate deeds. It's a boomerang. We throw out, it comes back. Reanimated, potentialized is what they say here. So the need to resort to edifying thoughts is really important because, as Joana de Angelis stated, prayer without words that is always heard is in the presence of edifying thoughts. So it's as if we're praying. I live in prayer is what Oprah said. So this is the need, because in the dramatic cases of Andreia Lewis, many of us are sitting here and saying, this is too drastic. If I read this book, this is not me. It's not my reality. We have to understand that there are countless cases, and we need to start observing our own cases here. It's not far from the reality that Andreia Lewis brings us. It's important that we educate ourselves. And more we start understanding the sense of responsibility in the way that we live, in the way that we think, and what we create around us. And so we see here that if thoughts are like boomerang, that it brings back magnetic forces upon returning it to us, it's going to bring back like-minded energy in the presence of spirits in the influence. And this is why every time we see a lesson in Spiritism, we are taught to cultivate elevated thoughts, the good thoughts, and that we should pray and be vigilant. Because after all, we are not yet able to maintain uplifting thoughts all the time. We have to be sincere with that as well. Once we begin learning about this, we are going to understand more and more. We affect not only ourselves, we have the ability to affect those who live around us, the very atmosphere of our planet, believe it or not, and this is very well explained as I know we don't have time. So we have to be careful because Paul reminded us that there is a great cloud of witnesses, that we should leave everything that hinders that keeps us from progressing, from evolving spiritually. We affect even those that are discarnate around us through examples of our thoughts and our actions as well. If we can't change the world, as we're talking about affecting others, affecting our society, affecting the world out there, we can start by changing the world within. Because that's a huge step in itself. The way that we see the world, the way that we react to the world, that's an improvement in itself as well. And cultivating prayer so that we can get in sync with the enlightened spirits. So that we can attract the minds that resonate like ours. We may not be evolved and have the presence of the good spirits because we think like them, but they are attracted to us. We attract them with our good thoughts and good intentions to make it right as well. Emmanuel will remind us that we need to start understanding that we are on this planet on our own individual journey with a destiny aimed at the stages of greater progress. That's why we're here. That on this great pilgrimage, we are all instruments of the forces with which we are in tune. We've been told that we are all mediums, and in this aspect of the force of thought, we start understanding that we have our own mental field, associating ourselves with the edifying energies when our thoughts flow towards a higher life, or with the disturbing and depressing forces, as long as we are still enslaved to the shadow of a primeval and tormented life. He goes on to say that through the sentiments that characterize our inner lives, our thoughts, all of us will emit specific rays and live within the spiritual wave with which we identify ourselves. That's what he says. And this is very beautiful as well. But one of the things that I wanted to end and leave an image imprinted into our mind today, into our thought, is the presence of Jesus. Because it says that we have the need to keep Christ in our hearts and mind in order not to become disoriented in our pilgrimage. He is the way, the truth, and the life. His examples of living, of loving, of forgiving is the way, the truth, and the life. Without the notion of responsibility, without devotion to the practice of the good, without the love of studying, and without a persevering effort in our own personal moral education, the liberating pilgrimage toward the higher life is impossible. And he finalized saying that we must understand that according to the rays we emit, our own spiritual dwelling will rise within the wave of thoughts preferred by our souls. What do we prefer to tune ourselves with? That's the question. And maintaining Christ in our hearts and mind so that we don't become disoriented, lost. We can't say that we can't find our way into this great pilgrimage that is our own, individually and then collectively. So let us think about this and leave with this image of this face imprinted in our minds, in our hearts, so that we can start modifying the way we think, the way we see things, the way we react to the world, to the people beside us, to ourselves. And let us always remember that all of these teachings are available in the amazing books that we have here, in the presence of a psychologist who can help us out, but highly, highly understanding that we are divine beings, that we are on our own way walking towards the light, and we do have the liberating key with the moral aspects of the Spiritist teachings. Thank you so much.